Bien, vamos a continuar con nuestra jornada de este mediodía.
Uso de obras en la era digital. Que sí, que no. Panelistas: David Grispan, Santa Clara University, Estados Unidos. Tonya Evans, University of New Hampshire, Franklin Pierce School of Law, Estados Unidos. Moderador: Francisco Espinosa, Espinosa Bellido Abogados, Perú.
Bien, continuamos con un tema que es bastante interesante, que también ha resultado en la práctica especialmente retador. Y lleva el título, este tema, de uso de las obras en la era digital. Que sí y que no. Y efectivamente para ello lo que hemos procurado es integrar un panel con personas con vasta experiencia en la práctica de este tema. Panel que será moderado por Francisco Espinosa. Francisco, de la firma Espinosa Bellido y Abogados, es abogado peruano graduado de la Universidad de Lima con un máster en Derecho de Propiedad Intelectual por el Franklin Pierce Law Center en Estados Unidos. Ha sido presidente de la Asociación Peruana de Propiedad Industrial y Derecho de Autor y del Grupo Peruano de AIPPI. Ha sido delegado alterno de Perú en Asipi y actualmente es presidente del Comité de Franquicias de Asipi. Con ello, entonces, dejo a Francisco en la moderación y tendremos las presentaciones en el orden de David Greenspan y de Tonya Evans. Gracias.
Gracias, Marco. Okay. Well, I will speak in English because our speakers are English speaking. Thank you, Asipi, for having us here. When I was first contacted by Asipi to moderate this topic, I was thinking about it for a while. And after some time, I realized that, of course, everybody now, it's not something new to think how we deal with technology and with copyright works in the digital era, but the first thing that I thought about is that almost every day, I have a 9-year-old daughter, and she doesn't have a cell phone. So she has downloaded, with our permission, I don't know if you know this app called TikTok. TikTok is this app where all these kids make these choreographies and lip syncing and all these things. That's in my daughter's TikTok is in my cell phone. So I receive all these alerts of all her friends from school that are downloading video and making all these choreographies. And that's it. That generation is learning from that age to produce content. To produce content and to upload it in social networks, and so that's something that we were not used to do, and they are, and that will, of course, keep growing, and that will be something very relevant, more relevant than it is now. So with that in mind, I would like to introduce David Greenspan. He has been involved in the video game business for over 20 years, working in business and legal affairs for some of the most significant video game publishers at the time in the industry. He has worked for Sony, THQ, Bandai Namco Entertainment America, and Midway Games. He has worked on more than 100 video games and has been involved in all aspects of video game development, publishing, licensing, distribution, marketing, and has negotiated hundreds of agreements covering these areas. David was the lead author of the white paper publication entitled Mastering the Game, Business and Legal Issues for Video Game Developers The book is one of the top all-time downloaded books for WIPO's creative industries and has been translated into Spanish, French, and Russian. He's currently working on the second edition. Mr. Greenspan teaches a class in entertainment transactions with an emphasis on the video game industries at Santa Clara University School of Law, where he has taught for more than 10 years. He has also taught at the University of Miami Law School, Hastings College of Law, and Pepperdine University School of Law. He has lectured about video game industry throughout the world, including many countries in South America, and promises to work on his Spanish. Prior to entering into the video game industry, Mr. Greenspan worked for an independent motion picture production and distribution company. David?
Okay, great. Thank you very much for the introduction, and it's a real honor and privilege to be in Lima, Peru, especially that I was able to successfully get out of Bolivia, which is also a wonderful country. So my background is in video games, but I'm going to talk first about the historical technological advances that have occurred over the years and how the owners of the intellectual property have reacted to that, and how the courts have reacted as well, and also what legislation has been passed in the United States. Sorry, but I do not have a PowerPoint for the first part of this presentation. The second part of the presentation, I'm going to focus on video games and how digital distribution has changed the industry and how the industry has dealt with intellectual property issues, including the copying of games and also advancements in technology, which have allowed it to do more than they've been able to do many, many years ago. So that's going to be my primary focus today, and I'll start my discussion by noting that throughout history, with the advancements of technology, there has always been issues on how to protect the interest of the copyright owner. And these challenges have resulted in the balance between legitimate interest of the creators by rewarding innovation and creativity and providing them with somewhat limited monopolies and controlling their properties, while at the same time balancing that against the interest of society. Copyright owners have historically followed a pattern whenever new technology has been introduced into the marketplace. The first thing typically is that they will say this new technology infringes their rights. Secondly, they have lost the ability to control distribution. Thirdly, it will damage them economically. And finally, many times these results in litigation, in which the copyright owners then proceed to the courts to try to resolve that problem. Sometimes they are successful, and sometimes they're not. And in other situations, new legislation has been passed to protect the owners after court decisions have determined that the new technologies don't necessarily violate the rights of the copyright owners. Furthermore, in many situations, the owners of the copyrights have had to decide on new business models in order to deal with the new problems in which they have been engaged in as a result of new technology. And this transition hasn't always been easy for many of the entertainment companies. You probably already know the issues that the music industry faced back in the 1990s when there was a lot of file sharing with music. And as a result, some have been successful, some have not been successful, but they all basically have to change the way they do business today as a result of digital distribution. And like I said, some have done it better than others. For example, the video game industry, despite the fact that there is a lot of illegal copying, has done very well with obtaining an incredible amount of revenue thanks to digital distribution. Historically, copyright has had to deal with a number of significant technological advances, which has caused pretty much similar issues over time. Prior to the printing press and during the Middle Ages, the church was the primary keeper and reproducer of books, with the work being undertaken by monks. Physical control of the original body of work meant control and access to that work. In the 15th century, the first significant technological event occurred with the invention of the printing press, thereby providing the means to make multiple copies for the first time. And the real beneficiaries of the right to print and sell books were the printers and the publishers. And I wanted to show you this commercial that I found and actually remember when growing up from the 1970s. And it involves monks, but it also involves the Xerox copy machine, which was revolutionary at the time. And when it was introduced, it follows pretty much the same pattern as the introduction of other new technologies. Machine is introduced, owners of copyrighted materials such as book publishers or magazines concerned that all of a sudden their material is going to be copied very easy considering the time, and as a result filed lawsuits, and many lawsuits were filed regarding copyright infringement. And one of the big things that the courts noted with this particular issue was the right of fair use, which is a significant defense that is claimed by defendants that they have the right under certain conditions to actually be able to copy material even though it's copyrightable material. So I'm going to show you this commercial. There's no sound, so I'll pretend that I'm the actors during this commercial. And so basically, to set it up, this monk has been working quite a long time, obviously, transcribing a book. And eventually, he's going to go to his boss or father and present it to him, saying, I have completed the work. The father is thrilled by the results of this, and then suddenly ask him, can you please give me another 400 copies? Well, how do I do that? Thank goodness for the new Xerox machine, which obviously the father is not aware of. He goes to the salesperson, and this is where Xerox starts advertising this particular machine, and you can definitely see how times have changed. Look at the size of this machine. So he gets his copies. Goes back to the father, and the father says, it's a miracle. So I think it's a fantastic commercial. And by the way, if I had known that my face was going to appear on this big screen, I definitely would have had a PowerPoint presentation for the first part of this discussion. So what happens next? The printing press is the biggest change to come about. And then next, during the 18th century, we're going to jump ahead quite a bit because of time limitations, two distinct systems were created in the United States and in England. And it started with England's Statute of Anne of 1710, which was recognized as the first law to protect the rights of authors with regard to controlling the printing of their works. In the United States, the framers of the Constitution drafted specific language to protect copyrights and patents in the United States Constitution, which is pretty amazing that they spelled out patents and copyrights and to protect us. And they wanted to balance the interest of society, but at the same time also protect IP owners and encourage them to share their work with the public good. And they did this by establishing Article 1, Section 8, Clause 8 of the U.S. Constitution. So what's the next significant technological advance was probably the phonograph. At the time, authors and publishers made their money from sheet music, and they did this. This was their primary source of income. And this is a good example of introducing new technology and the reaction from copyright owners who feel that they have been threatened by this new technology. And this is no different than when with the introduction of tape cassettes, which people use to copy music, video cassettes, where people use to copy perhaps TV shows and films, and also later disc. And every few years, the quality would get better and better. And in each case, the entertainment industry, once this new technology was introduced, would file a lawsuit saying that their copyrights were infringed, they were unable to control distribution, so forth and so on. Excuse me. And the Supreme Court, regarding the introduction of the phonograph and whether it in fact did violate copyright laws, ruled that the piano roll did not violate copyrights. And shortly thereafter, seeking some type of compensation, Congress, as part of the Copyright Act of 1909, introduced the first compulsory license system, thereby compensating authors and allowing for the development of the recording industry. And again, court decision. Perhaps people thought that that court decision was unfair to authors' works and therefore came up with a compulsory licensing system. The invention of the radio in 1895 and the television eventually in 1930 also dealt with musicians who thought that their work was being copyrighted and they weren't being compensated for that. And as a result, Congress stepped in and also created a compulsory blanket license for these rights. Next, the music industry tried to block the sale of tape cassettes. They were unsuccessful with that. In the mid-70s, most people know this very famous case involving Sony and the Betamax. It was the introduction of this particular machine that resulted in the film industry's attempt to block any further distribution of the VHS machine. And there's a fantastic quote that was made by Jack Valente, who at the time was the head of the Motion Picture Association of America. And the MPAA was basically the group that represented the studios, dealt with piracy, and also dealt with ratings. And his comment was, "I say to you that the video cassette recorder is to American film producers and the American public," you ready? "As the Boston Strangler is to the women at home alone." And that's an incredible statement. So the movie industry thought the VHS would absolutely destroy the film industry. What happens? This new technology, in fact, helped expand the revenue for the film industry. As a result of the VHS introduction, all of a sudden, the movie industry had this incredible additional resource of revenue. And then that would expand with the introduction of the DVD, the Blu-ray, which all of a sudden, studios were making more money from these technologies than they were making from film, at least for many of the projects. Now, because of digital distribution, no longer does the film studio see this revenue coming in from Blu-ray or DVDs, but they still make money. And again, it's an example of where an entertainment branch thought that this new technology would destroy them. So they went after them through the courts, and then fortunately, they were able to be successful from a revenue standpoint. So what did the Supreme Court say about this Betamax case? Because clearly, people had the ability at home to copy a show off the television. And the Supreme Court held that the products with substantial non-infringing uses, the video recorders, may be sold even if they are used for illegal activities. In addition, they noted that the sale of video cassette recorders did not constitute contributory infringement, and that the user's practice of reproducing a television program to watch is at most just convenient for them. They were time sharing. That was the main purpose. I'm eventually going to watch the show, but I'm going to do it at a time that's convenient for me. So the VHS was probably the biggest change, then eventually the DVD disc, the CD disc, and then fast forward a few years, digital media, social media come about. And this has been a game changer, because at the very least, when you're dealing with physical copies of materials, there's a somewhat easier way to control that. You got to stop the distribution of that physical item. And it's perhaps limited on who can produce this stuff and distribute it. And having said that, it was still a major problem for the entertainment industry. They claim that they've lost hundreds of millions of dollars. So now comes along digital, clearly having the biggest impact on the entertainment industry, with the exchange of information through a click of a button, as Francisco even mentioned. His daughter can click a button, and all of a sudden, she may not even realize that she's even dealing with copyrighted material. She just says, oh, I found this on the internet, I'll send it to my friend. But that would perhaps be a violation of the copyright laws, because all of a sudden, the owner of that photograph or anything else no longer controls the distribution of that particular copyrighted material. And part of the problem may be that a lot of young people, and even older people, don't understand the significance of copyright laws. And therefore, if they see something on the internet, they think they can do whatever they want. And how do you stop that? And the short answer is, you probably can't stop that right now. Maybe education is one way, but people are always going to copy stuff. And therefore, in one sense, you almost have to assume that copying is going to exist, and therefore it's very important to create a new business model to adopt to the environment to deal with some of these issues. And when talking about digital distribution in the digital world, also social media is included, and Black's Law definition, and Black's Law Dictionary is the most important book owned by most first-year law students in the United States, defines social media as any cell phone or internet-based tools and applications that are used to share and distribute information. And that's vast. That's almost everything. And that includes Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, blogs, chat rooms, comments to websites, and even more. And with digital distribution and social media, there has been a radical shift in the ability to control the distribution of copyrighted works, and it has become a real challenge for copyright owners. Everyone with an internet connection has the capability and the opportunity to access and copy content cheaply, and that's very important. They do it cheaply, they press a button, and the copies are amazing. So users anywhere in the world can produce perfect replications of copyrighted work in digital form at practically no cost. They can distribute instantaneously information to millions of other users with a click of a button throughout the world. And the fact that it can be done with a click of the button and sent throughout the world, how do you monitor that? It's almost impossible. And that's obviously one of the biggest problems when it comes to digital distribution. In addition, users commonly create derivative works with a variety of software tools and publicly display it. So, obviously, it's a big problem. Digital distribution has helped generate billions of dollars in revenue and is cheaper and faster to distribute, avoids the issue of retail, and can provide tremendous publicity through social media. But at the same time, it has also resulted in an unprecedented illegal copying, and according to the entertainment industry, has cost them billions of dollars. So is that accurate that I only have 2 minutes? Holy cow. Okay, so I'm not going to get into the video game thing, although I would like to. So maybe I'll try real fast. But the bottom line is that have the courts and the legislature been able to keep up with digital content? Not really. Perhaps the most significant thing that has come about has been the Digital Millennial Copyright Act. And what that does, at the very least, it tells service providers that in the event that they have on their site copyrighted material that has been illegally posted, that they must follow certain procedures to take down that material to avoid any type of liability. And that's significant because then they can claim that they've done nothing wrong and therefore are not liable. But as I mentioned, they have to do certain things in order to meet those standards. And the DMCA has been relatively successful, but it came about in 1998, and in 20 years, things have changed. And as a result, that law needs to be updated. One thing to think about when challenging intellectual property issues and the use of illegal copying is that it's not cheap to go about filing a lawsuit. Few companies can do that. They don't necessarily have the resources money-wise, or they don't have the resources to actually follow the internet to see if their material is being copied, and so that's a significant problem. Also, infringers can quickly disappear and reappear under a new name. It's a game of cat and mouse in many situations. And then you have jurisdictional issues. It is not easy going after an entity or person that may be stationed in a country that doesn't necessarily respect intellectual property laws, and you're trying to stop them from continuing to infringe on your intellectual property. So these are some of the big issues that companies have to deal with, and perhaps there'll be new legislation. The courts have been the primary answer to resolving a lot of problems, but they're doing so based on law that doesn't necessarily fit this space today. It may have been fine to deal with film issues or music issues back in the 70s and 80s, but to deal now with all of a sudden digital issues creates a problem. Courts are overworked. There are a lot of seats that are vacant in the United States. So again, that poses a problem. Are the courts the answer? Right now, they are the answer, but they may not be the best answer. And then combine that with legislation, which again, has helped, but isn't necessarily fulfilling its role of compensating authors who feel that their work is being infringed. So, I'm out of time. I can't do my video game presentation. I'm very bummed. Okay, anyway. All right.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much. Our next speaker will be Tonya Evans. She is Associate Dean of Academic Affairs and Professor of Law at the University of New Hampshire, Franklin Pierce School of Law. She directs the school's blockchain, cryptocurrency, and law online professional certificate program and developed its world-class instructor pool and curriculum. She's also the former chair of the Intellectual Property and Technology online programs. Professor Evans has expertise in the areas of intellectual property, new technologies, including blockchain and distributed ledger technology, entrepreneurship and innovation, including advisor to startups, entertainment law, trusts and estates, and municipal finance. She writes, speaks, and teaches primarily about the intersections of copyright and new technologies, blockchain and the law, and trust and estates. Professor Evans is a member of the Consensus Grants Advisory Board, Bermuda Global FinTech Advisory Board, International Telecommunications Union, Focus Group on Digital Currency, including digital fiat currency, the ITU Focus Group on Application of Distributed Ledger Technology, and also the Accord Project's IP Working Group, which works to develop best practices and standardization of small legal contracts. Professor Evans serves on the Intellectual Property Committee of the Advisory Council to the Court of Federal Claims. She also received the inaugural Enterprise Blockchain Award in the category of Governance and Policy Leadership during the 2019 Blockchain Revolution Global Conference in Toronto. Professor Evans is a graduate of Northwestern University Dean's List and Howard University School of Law cum laude. She also served as the Howard Law Journal Editor-in-Chief. She's licensed in PA, in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, and DC. Thank you, Tony.
Thank you. Thank you, Francisco, for the introduction, and also many thanks to the leadership at Asipi. This has been a tremendous presentation and conference, and I'm honored to be here on behalf of the law school and to connect with so many intellectual property lawyers from around the globe. So I'm very honored to be here. Go back one sec. So I'm going to dive right in and talk about the intersection of blockchain and distributed ledger technology, some of the use cases in the copyright area, and in what ways blockchains and distributed ledger technologies may disrupt and also may solve for some of the issues that David artfully raised about problems in Web 2.0 with respect to copyright ownership and leveraging content. In order to do this well, I just want to set the stage for the fact that blockchains, and there's not just one, but many different types, how it is set to disintermediate and disrupt the global economy in general. I'm going to focus on crypto assets in particular. Not all cryptocurrencies will define the rest of the taxonomy in the area of crypto assets. Some things function as a cryptocurrency, like a Bitcoin. I'll talk about that in a minute. But I just wanted to give a quick primer on blockchain so that we level set in order to figure out, based upon the best parts of distributed ledgers, how might it impact in a positive way copyright ownership and what we as lawyers can do in order to best represent our clients. So some statistics. So from a global blockchain in retail market size, 44.2 million USD as of 2017, which is projected by the World Economic Forum to reach 2.3 billion by 2023. And from Deloitte Insights, blockchain's business value add is set to grow to 176 billion USD by 2025. And finally, 10% of the world's GDP will likely be stored using blockchains by 2027. So it's not a matter of if blockchains and distributed ledger technologies will have an impact. The real focus is on how much and how quickly. When I start so I teach fundamentals in blockchain law in the online certificate program that I developed for the law school. And the definition of blockchain changes almost weekly as my students' understanding changes as well. But we start here, and I've highlighted a couple of terms that you'll hear. They're buzzwords that you'll hear a lot in the blockchain space. But blockchains also are just databases. It's a different way to organize information, all right? So they're decentralized databases maintained by a distributed network of computers, I'll say more about that in a moment, that rely on network effects and economic incentives in order to secure the network. So decentralized database, distributed network, network effects, and economic incentives. And in order to really appreciate a Web 3.0 world, we have to figure out about, first focus on the different iterations of the World Wide Web and the internet. We start on the left-hand side of your screen in a centralized fashion. Web 1.0, client-server, pure model, server disseminates information, clients receive it passively. There wasn't the type of interaction that David spoke of earlier in the information economy, where we move to decentralized but otherwise centralized servers. We have the FANGs of the world, Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Google, where we have a decentralized system in that there's not one central point of all information, but a number of smaller ones. And we are starting to see that there are really just a few kingpins in the world as it stands now. In order to envision the fully distributed system, if it bears itself out, I always think that there'll be some intermediary somewhere, but this is the vision at least, that you'd move to a fully distributed model, removing all rent seekers within the space so that we can have peer-to-peer true transactions, with those transactions being recorded to a database, and that recordation of that single point of truth is actually maintained by this distributed network of computers. I love this quote from Don Tapscott and Alex Tapscott. They're two bigwigs in the blockchain space. And in order to fully appreciate the impact of Web 3.0, think of it as no longer just the dissemination of information, but the exchange of value. Web 3.0 is known as the Internet of Value, to move not just and record not just financial transactions. The original and first blockchain was built to support Bitcoin, right? So that's why we focus so much on cryptocurrencies, but anything of value. And in that way, when we think of the value of intellectual property in general, copyrights in particular, it begins to make a bit more sense. I'll highlight some of the use cases in a moment. Where did it come from? I'm going to move somewhat quickly, not to rapidly move you through something that's important, but just to give you an idea of the history in a few slides, at least level set blockchain, and then we'll move on to the impact to intellectual property. So you may have heard of this person, whoever she, he, or they are, but Satoshi Nakamoto. We don't know who the person, the entity, the group is who created the Bitcoin blockchain, but it was based on a 2008 white paper, 9 pages, 9 footnotes, brilliant. And in that, it described this idea of changing the financial system, and it was happening in a time when there was a lot of unrest and a lack of trust in the financial system. We think that we live in a digital financial system now, but it really is just a digital veneer over an age-old double-entry ledger system. If I were to send $1 to David, my bank account would have to go down, and my bank would settle on my side, his bank would settle on his side, and there'd be some reconciliation. Same system, we just have the digital veneer. And that's what Satoshi intended to deal with, and to avoid the double spend problem, that I would send $2 when I only had $1. The components of the technology have existed a long time. In particular, the one in the middle of private public key cryptographic security, as well as digital signatures, peer-to-peer technology that David spoke about, and also the internet. They were all here. It was a novel way to aggregate or combine existing technologies that could have qualified for a patent, but that wasn't what Satoshi was about. But it was a novel way to create something new. In terms of the characteristics of blockchains, and now I'm talking about pure public permissionless, fully decentralized, no one is at the helm running the ship. And we have consensus mechanisms. The nature is being app-end only. You can add to it, but you can't take away from it. And the fact that it's disintermediated, David and I can transact directly through peer-to-peer technology, and also transnational, that it's borderless. So if I had more time, I would talk about all the concerns from a legal perspective about how it can be regulated, et cetera, et cetera. But let's hit the high notes of what it means for copyright. In one slide, I will now tell you everything you need to know about blockchain. We shall see at the end. But I wanted to break down exactly how it functions, all right? So again, we have this digital spreadsheet. It's a spreadsheet of transactions. My transaction to send 1 Bitcoin to David. And it's across a network of computers, not just one in that client-server model. Each computer that runs a full version of the blockchain's software, in this case I'm going to focus on the Bitcoin blockchain, is called a node. You don't have to run a full version of the software in order to transact in the space, but you could and participate in maintaining the system. Otherwise, you could just have your own Bitcoin wallet and you send it to the other person. You don't have to run the software, but if your computer does, then it's functioning as a node. And new transactions are broadcast to the network and verified by each node. Those verified transactions are grouped together in regular intervals. And it happens through consensus. I want you to look up all of these buzzwords if they're not familiar to you. There are various ways to achieve consensus. You may have heard of proof of work, there's proof of stake. There are a lot of different ways to achieve consensus. Those groups of verified transactions are called a block. And new blocks are added to the chain by a special type of computer node, and that's called a miner. You may have heard of Bitcoin mining, for example. So they're running the software. What those miners are doing are competing. this is the 101 variety to get through in time, but basically competing, their computers are running, trying to solve for this special equation. And if that node does, they've successfully mined newly minted Bitcoin. There are only 21 million that will ever be mined, and that's what makes it really special, really valuable as well. And they receive, the successful miner receives what we call a block reward. They get some of the Bitcoin. The blocks are interrelated final point to create a chain, because a small piece of information from the previous block is integrated into the next block, and this is what it looks like, because a piece of that previous data is incorporated into the new. So if you look at the bottom left, at the bottom, you'll see block 1 transactions. That's when they're all aggregated. They are distilled into an alphanumeric string. That string is added to the previous block's information, and that creates the block header, one single alphanumeric string. And then the second happens for block 2 and block 3. And so you can quickly see that if you get to block 3000, in order to change it, you'd have to change everything else. That gives it its security. And in that way, the blockchain is at least resistant. There's quantum computing and all sorts of other things that threaten blockchains in the future, but this is where we are now. With that, we go forward and talk about IP's value. I think everybody in this room understands the value of intellectual property, but this comes from WIPO to talk about, IP as being one of the most important assets from mergers and acquisitions, certainly for VC fundraisers. The value is clear, certainly to all of us. But we also know on the client side, it tends to be undervalued. You don't understand, undermanaged, and certainly underexploited. And the question is, in the blockchain sector, what IP use cases could that technology be used for to solve for some of the most pressing problems that we've seen in a Web 2.0 world? My glasses are not strong enough to see that small, teeny tiny thing over there, so forgive my back while I change. But here, it may provide evidence of authorship and invention. It may help in terms of registration. There's a state in the US, Illinois, now moving public records to blockchains. It's not pure public and permissionless, but it is a great use case for public records, and obviously that makes me think of the Copyright Office, for example. Controlling and tracking distribution, particularly for unregistered works, certainly for purposes of priority on the trademark side, for example, you could show first use or bona fide use on a specific date because of the timestamp. Digital rights management, DRM, this is critically important, and I'll show a couple of use cases at the end. Online music, cryptographically secured digital art, really is a game changer in that space for purposes of provenance and a whole range of other spaces. Establishing and enforcing IP rights, and this is where smart contracts, I have one slide dedicated to that to at least tee up the topic of how through the use of smart contracts you can better manage and leverage intellectual property agreements. This is one of my favorite about transmitting not only primary monetary compensation, but also downstream payments. If someone has cryptographically represented some artwork, for example, every time that token is transferred, they can code the token in order to pay upstream. No intermediary to have to be involved, and that's an exciting area. Authentication and this also is on the pharma space. For those of you who are in the patent space, companies like IBM and some of their clients are using it for supply chain. I believe we heard about that a bit earlier as well. We heard about some of the problems in a Web 2.0 world. I'll put up in the interest of time these bullets, but I think we're all familiar with some of the issues of that perfect digital copy that someone from, with their fuzzy slippers on in their bedroom can infringe on a mass scale. We don't have those technological barriers anymore to that type of high-scale infringement. And also the idea that that copy is almost as perfect, if not as perfect, as the master. So being able to distinguish between the two becomes very, very difficult. There's another type of blockchain called Ethereum, the Ethereum network, that was specifically built to support smart contract code. Next slide deals with that. And in this sense, the Ethereum network, the vision of it, and I think it began in 2014, was to support applications, to be the world's largest computer. And in that way, you could provide a host of services and applications that are decentralized and recorded to a specific blockchain, but had all sorts of different other purposes. Technically speaking, the Bitcoin blockchain can run smart contract code, but it wasn't built for that. So it makes it more cumbersome than systems like Ethereum. With respect to smart contracts, as I said earlier, and you may hear other people say, it's neither smart nor contract. And the reason is when we as lawyers think of contracts, we think offer, acceptance, consideration, meeting of the minds, and so forth. What smart contracts are really bits of code that automate performance. And so I want you to think of them more as performance mechanisms. The classic example is a vending machine, although it's not technically what we're talking about in a Web 3.0 world. But if something costs $1, or I'll say $1.50, I put in $2, I receive change in the vending item. It's automatic. I don't have to call anyone in order to facilitate performance. And in the same way, smart contract codes can facilitate performance of master agreements. If you've not heard of the Accord project, you might look into that. They have a specific working group in almost every legal discipline where they're really testing out different types of code in order to figure out how to best support master agreements. One cautionary tale is that smart contract code has to be audited. There's so many problems, and we don't have a rich database and years of experience to know which ones work and which ones may have a back door, and that's problematic. I don't really like a lot of text, and this one is from class, so let me just hit the high notes of fungibility. And the reason that I mention it, there's a specific type of token that runs on Ethereum, the network I just mentioned, and it's called ERC 721. Each token is unique, and in that way, the use of an ERC 721 may solve for some of the problems we mentioned earlier. Otherwise, most of the tokens, if they're functioning as currency or something of that nature, it's like money or commodities. One is the same as the other. What we are really trying to solve for in the Web 2.0 is how to make sure that you are protecting unique assets. And so what does that look like? The fact that blockchains are immutable, the fact that you can distinguish one from another, one token or digital asset or cryptographic asset is really important. And so it's quite interesting what one might do with ERC 721s, either for something that is purely digital or the tokenization of real-world assets. So you'll hear people talk more and more about that from an IP perspective. I'm happy to share these slides. I don't want to stress you out that I'm moving, but I want to get to the last couple to show the use cases in this time. And you can follow me at IPProfEvans on Twitter or visit proftanyaevans.com, and I'm happy to share the slides. So empowering creators, that's what we really want to talk about. I posed some questions to consider as you think about the technology. In what ways can we solve for some of those Web 2.0 problems? In what ways are existing copyright laws implicated by the fact that we have something that's creative? In what way does it impact the Digital Millennium Copyright Act in terms of takedown notices? If we can't append, if we can only append but we can't undo, what does that mean in this space? Moral rights. Orphan works, I actually think it's a really great use case because bits of information will always be connected no matter what. 3 areas of great interest in this space: blockchain-based gaming, crypto collectibles, and also this idea of self-sovereign creative asset management that really starts to empower creators to be in the driver's seat about how far down the road they might participate financially, maintaining and leveraging their existing relationships. And I want to show you this so that you can see some of the areas. Go back one more. These are some of the areas of great interest from a use case perspective. From registration, access controls. There are technological fences that we've put up through legislation, but maybe the technology gets us there in ways that the legislation does not. Final 2 points here. I wanted to show you 2 different areas. This wacky, wonderful thing is cryptographically secured digital art that only exists in digital form. And it is represented by a non-fungible token, an NFT 721. And in that way, there are prints that could be made. There are special art galleries where you can visualize this. Dada.nyc is a place where you can go and learn more about this particular project. But artists are already using this. That's why I love gamers, I love artists, because those are some of the first areas that we will see some movement. And then the final area for purposes of today is music. So Imogen Heap was the first artist to successfully release cryptographically secured creativity and also monetize on top of Ethereum, receive cryptocurrency in exchange for payment, completely disintermediating that as well. If you'd like to know more information about our blockchain and the law certificate program online, please visit law.unh.edu/blockchain, and I appreciate your time and attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Doña. Of course, very interesting and very new for most of us, all that you were explaining here. Before we go into the questions part, I think it will be very interesting to ask David to explain a little bit more about his background in video games and how he sees that would be the challenges in copyright in the digital era for the video game industry.
Thanks. So, can you put the PowerPoint presentation up? Because there's two great pictures that probably can give you a good illustration on where we've gone from Pong, which was a very popular game in the 1970s and basically became one of the first games that was mass marketed to the home market. And then you'll see another picture from EA's football game. But basically, for copyright, it's the bread and butter for video games regarding value. So for video games, copyright falls under two areas right now. There's not a specific area for video games, so they fall under one, audiovisual works, and then two, literary works, which covers the underlying software code. So what makes video games somewhat interesting in the copyright world is that it covers a number of intellectual property issues, the software and also what appears on your screen. And in this particular picture, it's not the best reproduction, but this is a picture from EA's FIFA 2020. And you can see that the reproduction is truly amazing. As you play this game, everything is as specific as it is in real life. And so this involves trademark issues, copyright issues. So for example, the shoes, the soccer ball, the uniforms, the player's likeness regarding rights of publicity, the team logos, the stadiums involving architecture, the names of the various advertisers. Everything is as realistic as possible because that's what the consumer expects. And how did this come about? Well, the advancements in technology have allowed game developers to create these amazing realistic games, which is obviously fantastic for trademark owners, also for game developers, and also for consumers. So game developers have to be careful that they're not infringing the rights of others. And to talk about copyrights, one of the biggest issues most recently, and this was shocking to a lot of people, but in the United States, there is a lot of litigation now involving a copyright issue involving players. And what's that issue? Tattoos. Well, who owns the rights to the tattoos that appear on the players? Can the players control the use of that tattoo, or does the tattoo artist control it? And the problem comes about because there's no contract, and most people thought, tattoos? Who's going to make a big deal out of that? But again, the technological advances that allows these creators of games to create the replication of tattoos is one issue that the developers now have to deal with. And by the way, there are a number of cases, but they haven't been litigated yet in court regarding that tattoos. Maybe next year we'll have the answer. So game developers deal with a lot of intellectual property issues, copyright on the screen, the story, the characters, the music, are all going to be copyrighted, and it's very important that game developers copyright those materials. And hopefully you'll ask me a question about digital distribution, but I just have one final comment. If you look at this game, you know, many judges at one time thought that it doesn't even meet the copyright minimum requirements. What's the creativity behind this? It's so simplistic. Fortunately, judges began to realize that, in fact, games should be copyrightable as they added new features, new patterns, so forth and so on. So the good news is that they are protected. Okay, so that's a quick answer for that question, hopefully.
Thank you, David. Because of time constraints, we have like 5 minutes for a couple of questions. Somebody has a question? Okay.
Hi, thank you for taking my question. I was wondering what was the situation between creators, because they have no control of, for example, creating a challenge or making a trend like ice bucket challenge. But there are other cases, as Netflix, for instance, that it's probably regulating more than the regular. And as I read, they were trying to control who was watching or from where they were accessing to the account. Is it a similar situation or completely different? Because in one we can control, but when it's a private company, they can control it. But also, like TikTok or Vine, they were also private companies, and they would not be able to. They were not able to control like creators or copyrights. Thank you.
Testing, testing. I should have done that earlier. It's a great question. Every time you are dealing with a private entity, they are setting the agenda and the terms and conditions of use. And we often opt in, this is the opt-in generation. It's a culture of actually opting out of participation in a network in order for networks like the Facebooks and creative content platforms like TikTok and other areas to really function. They want everybody to make sure that they allow for the mutual use of a lot of the content that is put up. By the same token, there's still a company behind that. They would still presumably be subject to DMCA takedowns, for example. It's a choice, it's a business decision. I was having difficulty getting access to my own Netflix account here, and I'm missing a lot, and I'm very upset about it. But with the geolocation of it's ordered to maximize their market share and their control over the content, and whenever we run up against that technological barrier, we know that there is a central intermediary there that is preventing it from a private company point of view. So some are more permissive than others, to be sure, but it really has the flavor and characteristic of being the same.
Well, I was just going to comment regarding the distribution. Most companies that control content are going to, in fact, try to limit it by territory. And that way they can make more money that way, which is understandable. And at the same time, there's certain regulations that they also have to meet within those territories. It's becoming harder to do that in Europe, though, because of the European Union. And one of the issues has become there's different pricing in different territories that a number of companies have tried to establish, including video game companies, and they have been nailed for that's illegal, illegal to do something like that. So that may be one of the issues regarding the distribution. But the other thing to also think about is the end user agreement that has become so important. And I think Tanya's absolutely right. It's a private company. They're going to try to get as much information as possible from the consumer. But at the same time, they also have to be very careful. They have to make sure that they have the licensing rights to use that property on their site. But they've also flipped it a little. And maybe that's because of the DMCA, but the end users are responsible, and they need to make reps and warranties and indemnify the service provider that, in fact, any of their content that appears on the site is, in fact, owned by them, or that they have sought and obtained the proper license. What happens, however, is that most people who do the click-through agreements and who are agreeing to these reps and warranties and indemnification have no clue what a representation and warranty or an indemnification clause is. And that's part of the problem.
There is, yes, bueno, thank you first, David and Tanya. It's been a great presentation. There are a lot of things that were left in the table, speaking about lunch. But of course, we will have more opportunities in the future to keep discussing this. This is a matter that won't go away. So thank you very much for your very interesting presentation.